Hi everyone, this particular lesson is on feminism and unequal citizenship. As noted, I expect you to be able to integrate the ideas from this lecture to your homework, your out-of-class assignment. So feminism can be broken up into two parts. One part of the definition focuses on the social movement, and the other part focuses largely on what happened in terms of the production of knowledge. Feminism is the advocacy of women's rights on the grounds of political, social, and economic equality to men. So this is the part that was really about kind of the social movement piece. The second part of the definition focuses in on changes to what we see in the academy. So feminism is an interdisciplinary approach to issues of equality and equity based on gender, gender expression, gender identity, sex, and sexuality, as understood through social theories and activism. So part of what that second part of the definition really gets at is really a kind of a change in the way in which we are thinking. Um, Feminism can be divided up into sort of three waves, in which we'll really sort of focus only on the first two. First wave feminism was really the earliest roots of feminism. And it was a period of feminist activity and thought that occurred within the time period of the 19th and early 20th century throughout the world, and focused predominantly on legal issues and access issues, and largely gaining women's suffrage, the right to vote. And that's sort of demonstrated in the pictures to the right. The second wave of feminism really kind of developed coming out of World War II towards the civil rights movement, even towards the present day. And in the 1940s, women gained increasing employment as men left overseas to fight in World War II. This was highlighted in the movie. And then it was really World War II that can be argued that was a major trigger for the second wave feminist movement that occurred after the war. Second wave feminism, however, really came to fruition during the 1960s in conjunction with the civil rights movement. And increasingly in the 1960s and 70s, second wave feminism diverged into two separate ideological movements. One is equal rights feminism and radical feminism. So, equal rights feminism sought equality with men in political and social spheres, where legislation and laws such as legalization of abortion and efforts to make women more established on the workforce, equal to men, were the primary goals. Under equal rights feminism, you would also see things like equal pay for equal work, and also a focus on the idea of representation. Given that over 50% of the women in the United States made up the population of the United States, shouldn't we also be seeing similar numbers in places like Congress? Then you had radical feminism, which wanted much more radical change to society. They viewed society as patriarchal and argued that society needed to be altered if women were to escape oppression. Part of this is really talking about the ways in which we looked at the world. Why were not women viewed as less than men? Not just in terms of rights, but actually in terms of how society talked about and thought about women. So, kind of the discourse around women. And radical feminism really wanted to fundamentally change that sort of ideology. Also, under second wave feminism was a call to really diversify and to acknowledge the differences that existed. Women of color found themselves underrepresented in both the racial and gender movements that were simultaneously fighting for greater equality. And so while Black, Latina, Chicana, Asian, and Native American women were active in feminist agendas at the time, they often felt conflicted because they were asked to put their feminist ideals often in conflict with racial solidarity. And so there was a lot of tensions within the broader feminist movement because they felt that a large percentage of the leaders were white and that the agenda had some stark racial contrast, and that what white women wanted was very different from what non-white women wanted. And so there was a lot of different critiques of the feminist movement about how it could also incorporate race and other issues. Some argued for what they called multicultural feminisms, and that this was really about understanding that each different racial group had very specific sort of sets of needs, wants, and ideas, and that should all be included as part of the feminist framework. Many of these feminists practiced what people called identity politics, that really sort of focused in on the different identity groups or status groups that they were part of. For example, Alex Walker, who was a renowned author at the time, disputed the term feminist as applied to Black women, and she writes that she has replaced feminism with womanist, remarking that a womanist does not turn her back on the men of her community. So part of what she was negotiating was that idea of what does it mean to both be Black and a woman, and we're going to talk about this more as we move forward. There are numerous different battlegrounds, and some of what you're seeing in the reading for this week with Adichie, as well as with Roxane Gay's discussion, is that there's a lot of negotiation in terms of how we reconcile what it means to be a feminist and what that word means in the contemporary moment. So Adichie, in her work for this week, really, in the video that you're watching, really talks about how feminism is still relevant on a global level. And although the feminist movement is already over 100 years old, there's still a lot of work to be done, and the status of women remains low in some countries in the world, and also in the United States. And it's also important to note that gender equality is still not universally true. So I think part of what we want to think about as we're moving forward are what rights should every person be entitled to. I'd like you to pause the video here really quickly and write down 5 rights that you believe all humans globally are entitled to. And next to that, I would also like you to just very briefly jot down why should each of the rights you've listed be universal. I'm probably going to ask you to hand this in, so make sure that you write it down. So when we think about the rights that you've written down, when we talk about it being universally available to everybody, these are human rights. These are the basic rights and freedoms that all people are entitled to, regardless of nationality, sex, national or ethnic origin, race, religion, language, or other status. This can include civil and political rights, which includes liberty and freedom of expression, but it can also be social, cultural, and economic rights, which includes access to food, work, and education. These are all spelled out under the UN, the United Nations Doctrine on Human Rights, which, if you cut and paste the link there into your browser, will show you the full breadth of what human rights can be envisioned as being. So one of the things I want us to think about is this idea of citizenship. And so when we think about citizenship, we often associate that with a passport, right? That with that passport, whether it's a US passport or a Canadian passport, that basically means that it's a state of being vested with the rights, privileges, and duties because of one's membership to a nation state. And so for those folks who are US citizens, we think of this as being determined by the US Constitution, federal and state statutes, and court rulings. So what are some examples of citizenship rights? Well, those are things that we have in terms of the Bill of Rights: freedom of speech, right to bear arms for the purposes of militia, freedom of religion, protection from search and seizure, trial by jury. It could also include amendments to the Bill of Rights, like the abolition of slavery, civil rights, women's suffrage, repeal of prohibition, and 18-year-old suffrage. Right? All of these things are examples of our citizenship rights here in the United States. But it's also important to note that citizenship is used to draw boundaries between those included as members of a community and entitled to respect, protection, and rights, and those excluded and thus not entitled to recognition and rights. So in other words, when you have citizenship or don't have citizenship, or if it's unequal citizenship, you often get treated differently. So I'd like you to be able to answer this question. I'd like you to think about this as we move forward in this class. Are citizenship rights distributed equally across different groups of people? Now, when I talk about groups of people, these can be groups of people separated based on race, class, gender, sexuality, etc. Part of what Nakano Glenn argues in her book Unequal Citizenship is that stratification or inequality exists because of unequal citizenship. So unequal citizenship refers to the ways in which rights, resources, and privileges are distributed unevenly across different social groups and categories. So, for example, when we think about the idea of the right of everyone being protected from protected equally under the Constitution and having the right to safety, is everyone treated the same in this regard? Or think about it this way: when we think about sexuality and gay marriage historically, are those who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, etc., are they treated equally in the United States relative to those who identify as heterosexual? Well, now you have the right to marriage, and that is a terrain in which those groups of people are equal. But there are still states in the United States in which, if you are out and tell people that you are LGBTQ, um, you can be fired from your job. You're not allowed to adopt. So when we talk about unequal citizenship, despite the fact that these individuals should have the same rights, they're not given them. So part of what I want you to be thinking about as we move forward is, what are some modern day examples of unequal citizenship? And is there a relationship between citizenship and human rights? So think about these questions as you move forward.